In a 2015 documentary interview, a former female Viet Cong fighter spoke, words that shocked military historians. "We were not afraid of the American GIS, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing," she said quietly. "We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. This wasn't propaganda. It wasn't bravado. It was fear spoken decades after the war ended, by a woman who had survived what many of her comrades had not. Her testimony revealed something the official military records never fully captured. The most feared unit in Vietnam wasn't the one with the most firepower or the largest numbers. It was 5 men who moved so quietly through the jungle that the enemy called them Hmong, the phantoms of the jungle. To understand why, you need to understand who these women were and what they faced. During the Vietnam War, approximately 138,000 women served in North Vietnamese forces. Some enlisted, most were drafted. They ranged in age from 17 to 24. They defended the Ho Chi Minh Rail against the most intense bombing campaign in modern warfare. They gathered intelligence in South Vietnamese cities. They fought in combat units alongside men, and they learned quickly which enemy forces could be anticipated, avoided, or ambushed, and which ones couldn't. American forces operated with overwhelming firepower. When they made contact, they called in artillery, helicopter gunships, and air strikes. The tactics were predictable. Vietnamese fighters learned to engage, briefly inflict casualties, then withdraw before the heavy weapons arrived. Former Viet Cong commanders described the pattern openly after the war. Fight for a few minutes. Hear helicopters approaching, break contact, and fade into the jungle. By the time American firepower arrived, the target was gone. Australian infantry operated differently, but still within recognizable patterns. They moved more slowly than Americans, patrolled more carefully, and didn't rely as heavily on immediate fire support, but they still moved in platoon or company strength. Their positions could be detected, their patterns studied, their routes anticipated. Vietnamese intelligence networks tracked Australian battalion movements and warned local units when sweeps were coming. The SAS was something else entirely. They operated in 5-man patrols that inserted by helicopter, then disappeared for weeks at a time. No one knew where they were. No scouts detected their approach. No intelligence network tracked their movements. They didn't patrol trails or sweep through villages. They simply vanished into the jungle and became part of it. Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian SAS conducted nearly 200 patrols in Phuoc Tri province and surrounding areas. They eliminated over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed, and their own casualties were almost non-existent. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing. That's a kill ratio unprecedented in the entire war. But statistics don't explain the fear. The fear came from how they operated. Vietnamese fighters could hear Americans coming from hundreds of meters away. Equipment rattled, radios crackled, voices carried through the jungle, but the SAS made no sound. They moved so slowly that a patrol might cover less than a kilometer in an entire day. They stopped every few hundred meters and sat absolutely still for 30 minutes, just watching and listening. They wrapped every piece of metal equipment in tape. They mixed mud into their uniforms to kill shine. They didn't smoke, didn't cook, didn't speak above a whisper for weeks. Former Viet Cong fighters, interviewed after the war, described the psychological impact. You'd be moving supplies down a trail you'd use safely. For months, suddenly your point men would collapse without a sound, then another, then chaos as automatic weapons. Fire erupted from positions you'd walked, passed without seeing. The engagement would last maybe 60 seconds, then silence. When reinforcements arrived, minutes later, they'd find bodies, but no trace of who killed them. No spent brass, no blood trails, no footprints. Just empty jungle that had swallowed the attackers completely. The female VC member's testimony in the documentary captured this terror. Precisely, they make comrades disappear. Not killed in battle, not dying. Heroically in firefights that could be understood and avenged. Just gone, erased. The not knowing was worse than the dying. You couldn't prepare for an enemy you couldn't detect. You couldn't defend against soldiers who were already in position before you arrived. You couldn't escape patrols that had been watching you for days, learning your routines, waiting for the perfect moment. Captured enemy documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned VC units about Australian SAS operations. The documents described tactics to use against American forces, techniques for ambushing Australian infantry, procedures for avoiding airstrikes. But for the SAS, the guidance was simple and chilling. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, assume you are already under observation. Assume they know your positions and strength. Assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. That assumption reveals the psychological warfare the SAS waged without intending to. Every trail became suspect. Every jungle clearing to conceal watchers. Every supply movement risked walking into an ambush that had been prepared days in advance. The SAS didn't need to patrol constantly or engage frequently. Their reputation did the work. Enemy units operated under perpetual uncertainty, never knowing if five silent professionals were observing them at that exact moment. The women who fought for the Viet Cong were not easily frightened. They'd survive B-52 strikes that turned jungle into moonscape. They'd endured artillery barges that shook the earth for hours. They'd fought American Marines and South Vietnamese Rangers in close combat. One survivor of the Perfume River Squad described the 1968 Tet Offensive in stark terms. We just kept shooting. If we didn't shoot, they would have shot us. These were not timid civilians. They were combat veterans who'd chosen to fight despite knowing the risks. But the Australian SAS represented a different kind of threat. American firepower was terrifying but impersonal. You could take shelter, disperse, survive. The SAS was personal. They watched you, specifically studied your habits, learned your routines, then killed you at the moment of their choosing. It was hunting, methodical and patient, conducted by men who perfected the art over years of jungle warfare in Malaya and Borneo. The testimony of that female fighter decades after the war ended reveals something profound about the nature of fear in combat. The most frightening enemy isn't necessarily the one with the biggest weapons or the most soldiers. It's the one who makes you feel observed, studied, and vulnerable even when nothing is happening. The SAS created that fear simply by existing and operating the way they'd been trained. When she said they made comrades disappear, she wasn't exaggerating. Between 1966 and 1971, hundreds of Viet Cong fighters died, never knowing who killed them or how. They'd been found. They walked trails they'd used safely for months. They occupied positions they believed were secure. They moved supplies through jungle they considered their own territory, and they died because five Men had been watching silently for days, waiting for exactly that moment. That's why she feared them more than bombers or battalions, because the SAS didn't just kill, they made the jungle itself feel hostile and alive with unseen threat. And that fear spoken honestly decades later is the most effective testimony to their tactical mastery.